Every Saturday morning, Mabel came. Same gate, same flask, same quiet smile at the security man who had long stopped asking questions. Nobody in that compound knew who she was to him. Nobody knew what happened behind that door. They only knew she came, without fail, without noise, without explanation. For 2 years, that was enough to make people talk. But the day everything changed, the day that silenced every whisper, every assumption, every smug conclusion the neighbors had already settled on, it did not look like anything special from the outside. It looked like a quiet morning. It looked like an envelope. Stay with Bola's folktales, because what was inside that envelope, nobody in that compound was ready for it. Number 14 Awolowo Close sat in a quiet part of Surulere that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be old Lagos or new Lagos. Solid buildings, painted gates, mango trees that had survived 30 decades of government and weather. The kind of street where everyone knew everyone's business and pretended otherwise at the gate. Chief Afolabi Roland had lived in the ground floor flat for 31 years. He had watched the neighborhood shift around him, the young people leaving, new faces arriving, and stayed put with the stubbornness of a man who had decided this was his place and that was the end of it. His children had suggested more than once that he move somewhere smaller. He had not budged. In his prime, Chief Afolabi had been someone. He ran a printing business on Lagos Island, stationery for government offices across 3 states, contracts that had his name moving through the right rooms. He had connections, a laugh that filled any space he entered, and a way of treating people that came from the old Yoruba belief that how you behave when nothing is at stake tells everything about who you are when everything is. The years had done what years do. The business wound down, the connections thinned, the laugh came less freely, slowed by a chest condition that had troubled him for 3 years and turned climbing stairs into something he had to think about first. His wife, Mama Dari, had passed 6 years before. After her, the flat went quiet in a way it never recovered from. Mrs. Fatombi, the housekeeper, came 3 mornings a week, but help is not the same as company. Help does its work and leaves. His children were not bad people. That needs to be said. Darif, his eldest, was a senior civil servant in Abuja, buried under the kind of workload that makes weekends feel like a rumor. Lara had spent 8 years building a nursing career in Canada, sending money home, meaning to visit. Wole, the youngest, had been in London for 5 years chasing a construction career that was always one contract away from taking off. They loved their father, the way people love things they assume will always be there, without urgency, without the discipline that love sometimes demands. None of them had set foot in number 14 for 14 months when Mabel Okoye first came through that gate. Mabel Okoye was 26 when she first came to that flat. She was from Asaba originally, had arrived in Lagos at 22 with a nursing certificate and the kind of quiet drive that never makes speeches but never stops either. She worked in a private clinic 3 streets from Awolowo Close. Long shifts, modest pay, and a particular kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the hours, the kind that comes from watching people suffer and knowing you can only do so much. Chief Afolabi had first come to her as a patient. He arrived alone one Thursday afternoon with a chest episode that needed monitoring. The intake nurse asked for a next of kin number. He gave one. It rang out 3 times. Mabel, on duty that evening, sat with him while they waited for his results, not because the job required it, but because the man was alone and had clearly spent years learning not to say so. They talked. He asked where she was from. She told him. He talked about the printing press, about paper, and the weight of a document properly bound, the way a craftsman talks about his trade. She listened fully, without the performing attention that people sometimes give to old men. When his results came back clean enough to send him home, he thanked her with the particular formality of someone who had been taught that gratitude said plainly is gratitude properly given.
2 weeks later, he was back for a follow-up. He asked for her at the front desk by name. That surprised her. Patients rarely did that. After the appointment, he paused at the door and said, almost to himself, that he had not had a real conversation in longer than he could place. She did not know what to do with that, so she said, without planning to, that she made a decent pot of pepper soup and could bring some the following Saturday if he wanted company. He looked at her for a moment, then he said he did not mind at all. That was how it started. There was nothing calculated about it. Growing up, Mabel had watched her own grandfather go quiet after her grandmother died, had seen how fast a man of standing can become invisible once the people around him get busy. She had made herself a promise then. She was not the kind of person who forgot those. She also was not the kind of person who explained herself to neighbors. What happened in that flat every Saturday was quieter than anyone imagined. Mabel arrived before 9, before the heat settled in. She brought whatever she had cooked fresh and set it on the kitchen table while Chief Afolabi finished his morning prayers. She never rushed him. A man who had spent his life on his own clock did not need someone else's. They ate, sometimes together, sometimes not. His appetite had become unpredictable. Then they sat, she in the armchair by the window, he in his chair across from it. They talked about Lagos, about Mama Dare, about the printing business and the contracts that had shaped it, about her work, the patients she carried home in her head, the difficulty of caring for strangers when everyone keeps insisting it shouldn't be personal. He was sharper than people gave him credit for. Age had slowed his body, not his thinking. He remembered details of conversations weeks old. He asked follow-up questions. He had opinions on everything from politics to the proper knot of an agbada, held with the ease of a man who had earned them over decades and saw no reason to apologize for any of them. He told him things he had not said to anyone in years. A business partner who betrayed him in the 90s. A wound that still hadn't closed properly. A trip to Ibadan with
Mama Dare
for their 20th anniversary, where she had laughed so hard at a market woman's joke she had to sit on a stranger's stool to recover herself. His children. Not bitterly, he was careful about that, but honestly, the way a man talks when he has accepted a thing without quite being at peace with it. Once, on a Saturday in October, he said that children are loans, that the world calls them back in different directions, and the wise parent learns not to clutch. Mabel said nothing to that. She refilled his cup. There were Saturdays he was too worn to talk, and they sat with the radio low, old Yoruba music he knew every word of, and she was slowly learning. There were Saturdays he was sharp and funny and reminded her of her grandfather so exactly it caught in her chest. She never told him that. Some things you keep. By the end of the first year, the gate security had stopped logging her visits. She was part of the compound, like the mango tree, like the evening call to prayer from 2 streets over. What the compound never saw was how Chief Afolabi prepared for Saturdays. Mrs. Fatumbi mentioned it once to a neighbor that from Thursday evening he would ask which biscuits Mabel preferred with her tea, check if there was enough gas to warm whatever she'd bring. He had started keeping a small notepad by his chair, things he wanted to tell her, questions he thought of, a proverb he wanted her opinion on. He never showed her the notepad. She saw it once when she reached for his cup. She pretended not to notice. Some dignities you protect by looking away. One Saturday in November, the rains had come late and the afternoon had turned grey and cool in the way that makes Lagos feel briefly like somewhere else. He sat quietly for a long while after they ate. Then he said he wanted her to know something, that whatever people in that compound had concluded about her visit, he knew exactly what she was doing and why, and he was not a man who forgot that kind of thing. She told him he did not need to say it. He said he knew. That was precisely why he was saying it.
She looked at the mango tree outside for a moment. Then she told him her grandfather used to say, the greatest thing you can give someone is the certainty that they are not invisible to you. She was 12 when he said it. She hadn't fully understood it then. Chief Afolabi nodded. Then he asked if she had brought the pepper soup or the jollof, because his chest was feeling cooperative and he intended to eat properly. People grow uneasy around kindness they cannot explain. The neighbors at number 14 had built several theories over the months. Mrs. Coker believed Mabel was a relative the family had quietly arranged. Mr. Badmus was certain she was positioning herself. He had seen it before, young women who cultivate old men and appear at the reading of wills. He repeated this enough that it became the compound's working conclusion, the one people settled on because it made sense to anyone who measured kindness by what the giver stood to gain. Mabel knew about the whispers. You couldn't be a woman in Lagos and not. She had decided early that she couldn't control what people concluded, only what she did. So she kept doing it. Dari first showed up at the compound 18 months in. He came on a Friday evening in a government SUV, wearing the kind of abada that announces arrival without needing to say a word. He stayed 2 nights, spoke to his father about everything except his father, and noticed Mabel on the Saturday morning with the look of a man trying to classify something that didn't fit his existing folders. He asked the chief who she was. Chief Afolabi said she was a friend who came on Saturdays. Mabel held Dari's gaze a bit too long, then excused himself for a call. He left Sunday afternoon and didn't come back for 7 months. Lara visited once, a brief stop between Canada and a family event in Abadan. She was pleasant to Mabel in the way that isn't quite warmth, called her dear twice, and asked how long she had been helping out, as though Mabel were domestic staff with unusual dedication. Mabel corrected nothing. She smiled and offered the remaining pepper soup. Lara declined and went to reorganize her father's medications, quietly dismantling everything Mrs. Fatumbi had already arranged. Wole never came. His presence lived only in voice notes Chief Afolabi would play with a particular expression, listening to his youngest son the way you listen to something that is both familiar and hard to place. None of them ever asked Mabel directly why she came. Perhaps they understood the question would require them to account for why they hadn't. One Saturday, Dari appeared unannounced again, 3 months after his first visit. The 3 of them ended up in the sitting room together, Chief Afolabi telling a story about a government contract from 1989 that had gone sideways in every direction before eventually making him more money than the original deal would have. Dari smiled through it, polished and slightly elsewhere. Mabel laughed at the part that was actually funny, the customs official, the missing stamp, the look on the minister's face. Chief Afolabi looked between them when he finished. Then he said, to no one in particular, that he hoped Dari would come more often, that the flat was quiet in ways a man should not have to get used to. Dari said, of course, Ba, of course, and looked at his phone. Mabel refilled the chief's cup and said nothing. After Dari left that evening, Chief Afolabi sat by the window longer than usual. She didn't fill the silence. Some silences aren't yours to touch. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the door with the careful steps of a man who'd learned not to rush his own body, and said goodnight in a tone that meant something more than the word. If you have ever sat with someone who needed company and chosen to stay, this story is for you. And if you haven't, keep watching, because what Chief Afolabi did next is the part nobody in that compound ever forgot. Before we go on, if this is your first time on Bola's Folktales, subscribe and turn on your notification bell. We tell the stories that live in the quiet corners of real life, the ones most people walk past. Now, back to number 14, Awolowo Close. In January of the second year, the chest condition worsened. Not dramatically,
not the way illness looks in films. It was slow and ordinary and relentless, which is how real illness tends to work. He tired faster. The walk from his bedroom to the sitting room began to need a rest halfway. His appetite, already unreliable, pulled back further. Mabel tracked the change across 3 Saturdays before she said anything. On the 4th, she told him plainly his breathing had changed and he needed to see a specialist, not his regular clinic, a cardiologist. He waved her off. He had the stubbornness of a man who had made his peace with what was coming and preferred to meet it without interference. She didn't argue. On Monday, she called his regular doctor, described what she had observed, and followed up until the referral was arranged. When Chief Afolabi arrived at the cardiologist 2 weeks later, the appointment was already made and his file forwarded. He hadn't asked anyone to do any of that. He looked at her when he found out. She shrugged and said the pepper soup wasn't going to make itself, so he should sort out his chest. He laughed, properly, fully, the kind of laugh that costs something when breathing is hard. The cardiologist confirmed what she'd suspected. Manageable, but requiring consistent monitoring and a medication change, not critical, a warning that had arrived just in time. Chief Afolabi came home from that appointment quieter than usual. They sat that Saturday with no radio and little talk. Later in the afternoon, he asked her to bring him the blue folder from the shelf in his bedroom, the one behind the Quran. She brought it without asking what it was. He held it on his lap a long time without opening it. Then he said there were things he had been meaning to put in order, and that a man shouldn't read until he can no longer speak to say what he means. Mabel said that was wise. He said he would need a lawyer, a good one. She said she knew someone, a woman who had handled her aunt's property matter cleanly 3 years before. He said to make the call. She did on Monday. Whatever Chief Afolabi discussed with that lawyer in the weeks that followed, he did not share with Mabel. She didn't ask. She had done none of this to be included in outcomes. She had done it because it needed doing, and she was the one who was there. That distinction would matter later. It would matter enormously. Chief Afolabi Roland died on a Tuesday morning in early March. Mrs. Fatumbi found him in his chair by the window, sitting up, facing the compound, dressed in his agbada, as though he had been expecting someone. The calls went out within the hour. Daire was in Abuja, Lara was in Toronto, Wole was in London. All 3 were on flights within 24 hours. Death accomplished in a day what years of living had not. They arrived within a day of each other and filled the flat with noise and logistics, the particular busyness of people who don't know how to grieve, so they manage instead. Dari ran things the way eldest children do, efficiently, authoritatively, with a quiet insistence that his version of events was the correct one. He arranged the burial, coordinated with the church, handled calls from people who had known his father across 30 years of business and life. He was genuinely good at this. His gift was turning chaos into sequencing. His limitation was that he applied the same method to grief, which doesn't respond to sequencing. Lara cooked. She filled the kitchen with her mother's recipes, iforiro, moi moi, or beata, working with the intensity of someone who needs her hands occupied. The food was real. The effort was visible. But she moved through the flat at a slight remove, performing the role of bereaved daughter with the careful professionalism she brought to her nursing work, correctly and from a distance from her own feelings. Wole was the quiet one. He sat in corners. He picked things up from the shelves, old business cards, a framed photo, a small wooden box, held them briefly and set them back. He was the one who broke first, unexpectedly in the kitchen on the second evening, over nothing specific, and then composed himself so quickly as if it had not happened. Of the 3, Mabel thought he was probably the one who grasped most clearly what had been lost. That understanding looked heavy on him. Mabel came on Wednesday, no flask this time.
She came to be present as she always had. She sat in her chair a while. Dari found her there and came in with the expression of a man who decided a conversation was overdue. He asked, not unkindly but not gently, what her relationship with his father had been. He used the word relationship the way people do when they mean something they're too composed to say outright. Mabel looked at him. She said she had visited his father every Saturday for 2 years and had considered him a friend. Dari nodded, slowly, filing it. He said he appreciated everything she had done, but the family was home now and they would take things from here. Mabel stood, thanked him, and left. She didn't cry until she was past the gate. Not because she was shattered. She had known this day was coming, the way you know things you don't let yourself dwell on. She cried because Chief Afolabi was real, and now he wasn't. And the chair by the window was just a chair again. And not one person in that flat had thought to ask if she was all right. Not Dari with his to-do lists, not Lara with her eforiro, not even Wole, who seemed to feel everything and act on none of it. She went home, she cooked nothing, she sat by her own window and listened to the street carry on the way streets do, without pause, without feeling, exactly as it had the day before. The lawyer's name was Mrs. Adunola Briggs. She arrived at number 14 the following Saturday, 1 week after the burial, with a leather briefcase and the unhurried manner of someone who had done this many times and knew the room was always more complicated than it looked. Dari, Lara, and Wole were seated in the sitting room. Mrs. Fatombi had been asked to wait elsewhere. A couple of neighbors who'd tried to linger near the corridor were redirected. Mrs. Briggs placed her briefcase on the coffee table, produced a sealed envelope and 2 other documents, and explained that Chief Afolabi had left specific instructions about how this meeting was to proceed. Before opening anything, she said, she needed to make one call. Dari said that was unusual. Mrs. Briggs agreed it was. She called Mabel. Mabel picked up on the second ring and told her the deceased had named her presence as a condition of the reading. Then Mabel said she would come. Dari looked at Lara. Lara looked at Wole. No one said anything. Mabel arrived 20 minutes later, still in her clinic clothes. Saturday shift. She took the chair by the window, the one that had always been hers, and folding her hands in her lap. Mrs. Briggs opened the envelope. The will itself was not long. Chief Afolabi had never been a man who needed many words when few would do. The flat at number 14, his savings, a piece of land in Abiakuta that his children had largely forgotten about, all divided equally among the 3 of them. Dari exhaled. Lara's shoulders came down. Wole gave one small nod. Then Mrs. Briggs turned the page. A second document, a letter, handwritten, dated 4 months before his death. She read it aloud as instructed. Chief Afolabi had written that he had spent much of his final years thinking about loyalty, what it actually looks like when it isn't performing for an audience. He wrote that his children were good people. He meant that sincerely. But goodness and presence are not the same thing, and a man who is dying comes to understand the difference in ways a healthy man simply cannot. He wrote that for 2 years, a young woman named Mabel Okoye came every Saturday without being asked, brought him food, sat with him, noticed when his health was shifting before anyone else did, and had quietly arranged the specialist appointment that led to the medication change the cardiologist believed had given him 2 additional years of life. 2 years, he wrote, that none of his children knew he had been granted. He had instructed his lawyer to establish an educational foundation, the Afolabi Roland Foundation, funded by a separate account his children had not known existed. He had appointed Mabel as its first trustee and director, with the mandate to support young Nigerians entering healthcare. Not because she had asked, not because she had positioned herself for it, but because she was the only person in his final years who treated him as though he still mattered. And a man's last act, he wrote, should reflect what he truly learned. The room held its silence. Dari spoke first. His voice was controlled, but the edges were coming loose. He said this was irregular. He said his father had been influenced. He said,
Mrs. Briggs stopped him. She had been stopping men mid-sentence for 20 years and had not lost the skill. The document had been prepared, witnessed and notarized 4 months before Chief Afolabi's final decline. She had met with him 3 separate times and found him fully lucid on each occasion. She set the notarized copies on the table with the quiet authority of someone who anticipated every objection before the room knew it would make them. Dere sat back. Lara looked at the letter. Then she looked at Mabel, really looked, maybe for the first time, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite grief, but was made of the same material as both. Wale stared at the floor. Mabel did not smile. She did not look satisfied. She was looking at the wall above the window, the same wall she had looked at every Saturday for 2 years while the chief talked, thinking about a man who had been clear-eyed enough at the end to see everything honestly and generous enough to say it in writing. The news spread through number 14 like compound news always does, quietly at first, then everywhere. Mrs. Coker, who had believed Mabel was a family arrangement, told people she had always sensed something special about that young woman. Mr. Badmus, who had been loudest about the positioning theory, said nothing for several days, the closest he was capable of getting to an apology. The security man at the gate told anyone who would listen that he had always known. Dere hired his own lawyer to challenge the foundation. It went nowhere. The documents were clean, the witnesses solid, and no court was going to set aside a lucid man's final wishes because his son was embarrassed. The challenge was dropped inside 6 weeks. Lara called Mabel a month later. She didn't apologize. She wasn't made for that, and Mabel hadn't expected it. She said she wanted to understand who her father had been in those last years. She asked if Mabel would share some of what they had talked about. Mabel said yes. They talked for an hour. Lara cried twice. Mabel stayed on the line both times. Wale said a text, 3 words, "Thank you for being there." Mabel read it 3 times and saved it in a folder she never named. The Afolabi Roland Foundation was formally registered within the year. Its first cohort, 12 young people from low-income backgrounds, training in nursing and medical laboratory science, was announced at a small ceremony in a Surulere community hall at Mabel's request. Not far from Awolowo Close, not far from the clinic where a young woman had sat with an old man while they waited for results, and offered, without thinking, to bring pepper soup the following Saturday. People ask the wrong question about stories like this. They ask what Mabel gained. They add up the foundation, the directorship, the sudden respect from people who hadn't offered any before, and they try to find the lesson buried inside the reward. But that is the wrong place to look. The real question is, what did she give and why before any of it existed? She gave time she didn't have, Saturdays that could have been rest, attention to a man the world had quietly set aside. She gave it without a record, without an audience, without once checking over her shoulder to see if anyone was watching. Chief Afolabi did not reward her loyalty. He witnessed it. Those are not the same thing. The reward had already accumulated in the kind of person she was becoming every time she chose to show up when it cost her. The lesson isn't that kindness pays. It's that people whole enough to give without calculating are the only ones who can receive without being undone by what they receive.
Dari, Lara, and Wole were not wrong to build their own lives, but they had made the mistake that capable, occupied people often make. They told themselves their father understood the distance, that love felt across an ocean was the same as love expressed in the room. He did understand. That was the thing. He understood completely, and he wrote it down. If this story stirred something in you, if it brought someone to mind, someone you keep meaning to call, someone you tell yourself will always be there, don't let that feeling pass without doing something with it. Subscribe to Bola's Folktales and turn on your notification bell. We are here every week with the stories that live in the parts of life most people walk past without stopping. There is more still to come. We will see you in the next one. Before you go, drop your answer in the comments. Was Chief Afolabi right to do what he did? Or should family always come first, no matter the distance? And if you know someone who needs to hear this story today, send it to them now.